The sound of clinking glasses and soft jazz filled the grand ballroom. The chandeliers sparkled like 1,000 tiny stars, reflecting against the marble floor. Every corner of the hall spoke of money. Fine silk curtains, silver trays, and people dressed in designer suits. It was the annual gala hosted by Edward Langston, a man known for his wealth, his pride, and the way he liked everyone to know who was in charge. Edward stood near the center of the room, his tall figure surrounded by guests who laughed at everything he said, even when it wasn't funny. He had built his company from a small business into an empire, and now he loved reminding people of it. To him, every smile, every compliment was just proof of his importance. But among all the shining faces, one woman moved quietly through the crowd, unnoticed. Clara Hayes. She wasn't one of the guests. She was part of the staff, one of the workers who came before the party to clean the hall and stayed until everyone left. Her uniform was neat but faded, her shoes slightly worn and her hair tied back simply. She tried her best to go unseen, not because she was shy, but because she didn't want trouble. Clara carried a tray of empty glasses toward the kitchen, moving carefully so she wouldn't bump into anyone. Every now and then she caught snippets of conversation, talk about luxury vacations, cars, business deals. None of it felt real to her. Her world was far simpler, bills, rent, and long shifts. Still, she didn't envy them. She had learned long ago that money didn't always mean happiness. What the people around her didn't know was that Clara had once dreamed of a life very different from this one. When she was younger, she had studied music. The piano, to be exact. Her mother had been her teacher, and their small apartment was always filled with the sound of melodies that could make even the dullest day feel alive. Clara had talent, a natural gift, her teachers used to say. But when her mother passed away and the bills started piling up, music became a luxury she couldn't afford. She took a job cleaning offices, then restaurants, and eventually ended up working part-time at Langston Enterprises. It wasn't her dream, but it was honest work. At night, when the building was empty, she sometimes sat at the piano in the company's lounge. The same piano Edward Langston had bought for decoration, not for music. She would play quietly just for herself. It reminded her of who she used to be, and maybe who she still was somewhere inside. That night, as the gala continued, Edward gave a short speech about success, hard work, and how some people are simply born to lead. The crowd clapped enthusiastically, raising their glasses. Clara stood near the back, pretending not to listen, though she heard every word. She couldn't help thinking how strange it was, how people could talk about hard work while others like her worked harder than anyone and still struggled to get by. After the speech, Edward moved through the crowd, greeting his guests like a king meeting his court. His assistant followed him closely, whispering names and details so he wouldn't forget who was who. Every few minutes, someone would tell him how inspiring he was or how brilliant his business ideas were. He smiled politely, though deep down he enjoyed every bit of the praise. When Edward noticed Clara standing near the corner, his eyes narrowed slightly. "Who's that?" he asked his assistant. "Oh, just one of the workers, sir," she replied quickly. "Part of the cleaning staff." Edward nodded but didn't look away. There was something about her calm, steady posture that caught his attention. She wasn't fawning over him or trying to please anyone. She was just quietly doing her job. For someone like Edward, that kind of indifference was strange and slightly annoying. As the night went on, Clara passed by the grand piano in the center of the hall. It was a magnificent instrument, glossy black, standing proudly under the chandelier light. She paused for just a second, her fingers twitching slightly as if they remembered what it felt like to press the keys. "Careful," a waiter whispered as he passed. "That thing's worth more than both of us." Clara smiled softly and kept walking. From across the room, Edward noticed the small moment. He leaned over to one of his business friends and said with a smirk, "You see that cleaner? She was staring at my piano like it's made of gold." His friend chuckled. "Maybe she's never seen one before." Edward laughed, though the idea sparked something mischievous in his mind. He liked moments when he could show his power, remind people of their place. He didn't mean to be cruel, at least not in his own eyes, but he enjoyed feeling above others. It made him feel secure. By the time the clock neared 10, most guests were a little tipsy, the air filled with chatter and laughter. Edward clapped his hands to get everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced loudly, "let's have some entertainment, shall we?" The crowd turned toward him with interest. "Who's performing tonight?" someone asked. Edward grinned. "Actually, I have a better idea." His eyes scanned the room until they found Clara. "You there," he said, pointing. "Come here for a moment." Clara froze, unsure if he was really talking to her. The room went quiet, and she could feel every eye turn in her direction. Her heart began to pound. "Come on, don't be shy," Edward said in a playful tone, though the smirk on his face didn't feel kind. "I saw you eyeing that piano earlier. Do you know how to play?" A few people laughed softly. Clara's face flushed. She wanted to say no and walk away, but she also knew refusing might cost her job. Edward was the kind of man who liked obedience. "I used to play a little," she said quietly. Edward raised an eyebrow. "Used to? Well then, let's see if you still can. Go ahead, play us something." The crowd murmured with amusement. Some were curious, others uncomfortable. The idea of a cleaning worker performing for a room full of millionaires felt awkward, even cruel. But no one dared to stop it. Clara hesitated. Her hands felt cold and her throat was dry. She looked at the piano, that beautiful silent thing she had only touched in secret. A part of her wanted to refuse, but another part whispered that maybe this was her moment, even if it came from mockery. So she took a small breath and stepped forward. The crowd parted slightly as she walked, and though she kept her eyes down, she could feel their stares. Edward leaned back in his chair, satisfied. "She's actually doing it," someone whispered. Clara sat on the bench and placed her hands on the keys. The room seemed to fade for a moment. All the noise, all the eyes, it all disappeared. She remembered being a child again, sitting beside her mother, learning her first song. Her mother's gentle voice came back to her mind, saying, "Don't just play the notes, Clara. Feel them." Her fingers trembled. She hadn't played in years. What if she made a mistake? What if they laughed? But then she realized, what did she really have to lose? She pressed the first key. A soft note filled the air, pure and gentle. Then another and another. The melody began to take shape, fragile at first, like a whisper. But just as the music began to build, Edward interrupted. "Louder!" he said with a grin. "We can barely hear you from back here." Laughter rippled again. Clara's hands froze for a second, but she didn't look up. She took another deep breath and started again, this time a little stronger. The crowd still thought it was a joke. They expected clumsy notes or a simple tune, something to laugh about later, but none of them had any idea what was coming. Clara's eyes were calm now, her hands steady. The sound began to change. It wasn't awkward anymore, it was beautiful, rich, alive. And in that moment, though no one yet realized it, the story was about to take a turn none of them would ever forget. Clara sat at the piano, her heart racing. The laughter from the crowd still echoed in her ears. She wasn't angry, not yet. She was more nervous than anything else. Her hands rested on the smooth keys, and she could almost feel her mother's presence beside her. For a brief second, she forgot the people watching her. She forgot about Edward's smirk and the fancy dresses all around. All she remembered was the sound of home, of simpler times. When she pressed the first few keys, the melody was quiet, almost shy. The guests whispered to each other, expecting a clumsy tune, something they could giggle at later. Edward leaned back, clearly enjoying himself. He had no idea what was about to happen. Clara's fingers started to move faster. The notes came alive, not in a rushed way, but with purpose. The music began to fill the hall, echoing off the marble walls like a soft wave. People stopped talking. The laughter faded. Every key she touched seemed to tell a story, one of loss, hope, and quiet strength. The crowd, once full of noise and chatter, stood frozen, listening. Edward's smile faded. He had expected to embarrass her, to prove that she was just another worker trying to act above her place. But what he saw was something completely different. The woman sitting at his piano wasn't a cleaner anymore. She was an artist, someone who had spent years hiding her gift behind silence and hard work. Her body moved with the rhythm, her face calm, her eyes closed as if she were lost in another world. Every note reached into the hearts of the people in the room. Some guests even forgot to breathe. They weren't just hearing music, they were feeling it. It was raw and real, something money couldn't buy or fake. The song carried sadness, but it also carried strength, like a quiet voice saying, "I'm still here." The melody built up, growing stronger, deeper. The air seemed to vibrate. For a moment, the ballroom didn't feel like a place of wealth and ego. It felt like a place of truth. The piano wasn't just an instrument anymore. It was Clara's voice. When she finished the last note, the silence that followed was heavy. No one clapped right away. They were too stunned. Then slowly one person started to applaud. Another followed. And soon, the whole room was filled with the sound of hands coming together, a roar of appreciation that shook Edward to his core. Clara stood up quietly, her hands still trembling a little, but her face was calm. She looked neither proud nor shy. Just peaceful. Edward sat still, his eyes locked on her. He didn't say a word. For once, he had nothing clever to add. He had been silenced by something he didn't understand. Real talent, real emotion, something no amount of money could control. After the performance, people began to approach Clara. A few guests asked her where she learned to play. Others simply thanked her for the music. She smiled politely but didn't say much. She wasn't used to attention like this, and deep down she didn't trust it. She knew how quickly admiration could fade once people remembered who she was. The event slowly returned to normal, though something had changed in the air. The same people who had looked at her like she didn't belong were now looking at her differently, with respect, even awe. Edward tried to act like nothing had happened, but his mind was spinning. His own arrogance had created the most memorable moment of the night, and it wasn't because of him, it was because of her. As the crowd thinned out and the music from the speakers replaced the real melody she had played, Clara returned to her quiet duties. She gathered empty glasses, wiped tables, and made sure the place stayed spotless. But her hands still felt warm from the keys. The music still echoed in her heart. She didn't play to impress anyone. She played because it was who she was. Later that night, as the guests began to leave, Edward found himself wandering near the piano again. He looked at the keys, still faintly reflecting the chandelier light. He had heard many pianists before, professionals hired for events, but none of them had made him feel what she did. There was honesty in her playing, something pure. It unsettled him, because it reminded him of a part of himself he'd buried long ago, before the money, before the pride. He glanced toward the far end of the hall where Clara was cleaning up. For a moment he thought about saying something, an apology, perhaps even a compliment, but the words wouldn't come. He wasn't used to admitting when he was wrong. Clara noticed him looking and gave a small nod, polite but distant. She didn't expect anything from him. She wasn't bitter, just tired. The night had been long, and though people's reactions surprised her, she knew tomorrow would be the same. The glamour would fade, and she'd still be just another worker in the eyes of people like Edward. When the event finally ended and the lights dimmed, Clara lingered for a moment. The piano stood quietly in the center of the room, its surface shining under the last bit of light. She walked over and gently touched the keys one last time. No one was watching now. She played a short tune, something soft and sweet. A goodbye to the night, to her mother, and maybe to the dream she had put aside for so long. Edward watched from the doorway, unseen. For the first time in years he felt small, not because of money or power, but because he realized how much he had lost in trying to be above everyone else. He left without a word, but the sound of her final notes followed him all the way home. Clara finished her shift and stepped outside. The night air was cool and the city was quiet. She pulled her jacket tighter and started walking toward the bus stop. There was a faint smile on her face. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for once she didn't feel invisible. She had reminded herself and everyone else that talent, kindness, and grace didn't depend on titles or paychecks. They came from the heart. As the bus arrived, she looked back at the building one last time. The lights inside were slowly turning off. She could still hear the echo of her music in her mind, and it made her feel lighter. She had faced humiliation, but she had turned it into something beautiful. And deep down, she knew that this wasn't the end of her story. Something had changed. Not just in the people around her, but in herself. Edward, meanwhile, sat in his car outside for a long time, staring at the steering wheel. He couldn't explain why he felt uneasy. The image of Clara at the piano wouldn't leave his mind. For the first time, he questioned his own behavior, his arrogance, his need to look powerful. Maybe he had crossed a line tonight, and maybe, just maybe, he had something to learn from the woman he tried to humiliate. He didn't know it yet, but this night was going to change both of their lives in ways neither of them could imagine. The next morning, the city woke up to its usual rush, but something in Clara's heart felt different. She was tired, but her mind kept replaying the sound of her own music from the night before. Every note she had played still lingered in her memory, soft but powerful. She had gone home on the bus, watched the sunrise from her window, and for the first time in a long while, she had felt proud of herself. Not because people clapped or noticed her, but because she had finally found her voice again. When Clara arrived, at work later that day, the atmosphere in the building felt unusual. People who usually ignored her suddenly looked her way, whispering quietly as she passed. Some even smiled awkwardly, unsure of what to say. She wasn't sure if they were impressed or simply surprised that a cleaning worker could do something extraordinary. She decided not to think too much about it and just focused on her duties like always. She went about her morning routine, dusting the lobby tables, arranging flowers, and checking the meeting rooms. Everything felt familiar, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. By noon, her supervisor called her to the office. Clara hesitated for a moment, wondering if she had done something wrong. "Clara," her supervisor said kindly, "Mr. Langston would like to see you in his office." Her heart skipped a beat. Edward Langston, the same man who had humiliated her in front of everyone last night. Why would he want to see her now? Did he say why? She asked quietly. "No," the supervisor said. But he didn't sound angry, just serious. Clara nodded and made her way upstairs. The top floor of the building was like another world, quiet, polished, and filled with expensive furniture. When she reached Edward's office, she paused at the door, took a deep breath, and knocked lightly. "Come in," his voice called from inside. She entered slowly. Edward was standing near the large window looking out over the city skyline. The morning light made the room look brighter than usual, but his face was unreadable. "Good morning, sir," Clara said politely. Edward turned around and studied her for a moment. He didn't look smug or arrogant like he usually did. He seemed thoughtful, maybe even uneasy. "Clara," he said finally, "I wanted to talk to you about last night." She stayed silent, unsure how to respond. "I owe you an apology," he continued after a pause. "What I did was wrong. I shouldn't have called you out like that. It was disrespectful." Clara blinked, not expecting to hear those words. Edward Langston wasn't known for apologies. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he added. "I just thought it would be a bit of fun. But when you played—" He stopped for a moment, searching for the right words. "It was something else. You were incredible." Clara didn't know what to say. She nodded politely, though her heart was racing. "Thank you," she said softly. "I just played what I remembered." He smiled faintly. "How long have you been playing?" "Since I was a child," she said. "My mother taught me, but I stopped after she passed away. I had to work, so I never really had the chance to continue." Edward leaned against his desk, listening carefully. There was something genuine in his expression now, something she hadn't seen before. "Respect. You know," he said slowly, "your performance last night. People can't stop talking about it. I even got a call this morning from one of the guests. Turns out he's connected to a local music foundation. He asked about you." Clara's eyes widened. "About me?" "Yes," Edward nodded. "He thought you might be interested in performing again, at one of their charity concerts." She was silent for a moment, unsure if she had heard correctly. It felt surreal. The same event that had started as an attempt to humiliate her had somehow turned into an opportunity. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say yes," Edward said simply. "You deserve it." Clara looked down at her hands. "It's kind of you to say that, but I'm not sure I belong in places like that." Edward shook his head. "You belong wherever your talent takes you." For a moment, the room was quiet. The tension that had once existed between them was gone, replaced by something almost warm. Edward seemed different. Not softer exactly, but more human. Maybe her music had reached him in a way that words never could. I can help arrange it, he said after a pause. If you want. Clara hesitated. Part of her wanted to say yes immediately, but another part was afraid. What if she wasn't good enough anymore? What if last night had just been luck? I'll think about it, she said finally. Thank you. Edward nodded. Take your time. Whatever you decide, just know that what you did last night was special. She smiled politely and left the office. As she walked down the hall, her mind spun with thoughts. For years, she had buried her passion under work and survival. Now, out of nowhere, life was offering her a second chance. It was exciting and terrifying all at once. That evening, after her shift ended, Clara stopped by a small park near her apartment. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Children were playing, and the air smelled faintly of flowers. She sat on a bench and let her thoughts settle. Her mother used to bring her here after piano lessons. She could almost hear her mother's voice, gentle and full of love. Music is a gift, Clara. Never let it fade. Tears welled in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. She didn't want to cry out of sadness. This time, it was something else. Hope. For the first time in years, she felt it clearly. The next few days went by quietly, but the news about her performance spread through the company. People who had never spoken to her before began greeting her with smiles. Some even asked if she would play again. It was strange, but she stayed humble, keeping to her work. She didn't want to let attention change her. She knew who she was. Edward, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about her music. He found himself replaying the moment in his mind. Her calm face, her steady hands, the sound that filled the room. It had stirred something in him that success never had. Even looked up her background out of curiosity and learned that she had once been offered a scholarship to a music academy, but had to decline it due to her family's financial struggles. The discovery made him think deeply about how easily life could change for people, depending on their circumstances. One afternoon, he called his assistant and said, I want to find out more about that music foundation. Let's see what we can do to support it. His assistant raised an eyebrow. For Clara? Edward hesitated. For people like her, he said simply. Meanwhile, Clara finally decided to visit the music foundation mentioned by Edward. She met a kind man named Mr. Bennett, who managed community events for local artists. He had seen her play at the gala and still remembered how moved the audience was. He offered her a chance to perform at an upcoming charity concert. Nothing grand, just a small event to raise funds for music education. At first, Clara felt unsure. She hadn't performed publicly in years. But Mr. Bennett's encouragement and Edward's unexpected support gave her courage. She agreed to do it. When she returned home that evening, she sat at her old keyboard, a second-hand one she had bought long ago. It had a few broken keys, but it was enough for practice. She closed her eyes and started to play, slowly at first, then more freely. The sound filled her small apartment. Her fingers remembered what her heart never forgot. Days turned into weeks. Every night after work, she practiced. Her neighbors often stopped to listen quietly from the hallway. No one complained. They said her music made the building feel alive. Even when she was exhausted, Clara found strength in those moments. She felt like she was rebuilding a piece of herself, one note at a time. Edward occasionally checked in, though always respectfully. He never made her feel pressured or indebted. Instead, he seemed genuinely happy to see her pursuing her passion again. He even attended one of her practice sessions at the foundation. When he heard her play there, not for a crowd but for herself, he finally understood why that night had affected him so deeply. He realized that while he had been chasing money, she had found something far more valuable. Purpose. And maybe that was what he had been missing all along. By the end of the month, the concert date was set. Clara's name appeared quietly on the event flyer listed among other performers. It wasn't flashy, but it meant everything to her. She had no idea what the future would hold, but she finally felt like her story was beginning again, and this time it would be written in her own rhythm. The evening of the charity concert arrived, and the small community theater buzzed with quiet excitement. It wasn't a grand place like the ballroom where Clara had played before, but there was something warm and welcoming about it. The walls were covered with old posters from past performances, and the stage lights cast a soft glow over the piano sitting in the center. For Clara, this night felt like a new beginning. It had been years since she played in front of an audience by choice, not by force. Backstage, she paced nervously, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her simple dress. She had chosen it because it reminded her of her mother, modest but elegant in its own way. The sound of people chatting filled the hall. Some were familiar faces from the company. Others were strangers. She had no idea who exactly would be out there, but she knew one thing for certain. This time, she was here because she wanted to be. As she peeked through the curtain, she saw Edward sitting quietly in the third row. He wasn't surrounded by his usual crowd of admirers or assistants. He looked out of place, yet strangely humble. For a man who spent his life in control, tonight he seemed to be here just to listen. When it was her turn to perform, the announcer called her name. Clara took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The lights felt bright on her face, and for a moment her vision blurred from the glare. The audience clapped politely. She sat down at the piano, feeling the smooth keys under her fingertips. Her hands trembled slightly, but this time it wasn't fear. It was anticipation. She began to play. The first few notes floated softly through the room, like a whisper carried on air. Then the melody grew stronger, fuller, and soon the entire hall was wrapped in sound. People leaned forward, drawn in by the depth of emotion in every note. Clara didn't look at anyone. She didn't need to. She was lost in the music, in the story she was telling through every rise and fall of the melody. This time, her song wasn't about pain or humiliation. It was about healing, about rediscovering what she had thought was lost. The keys spoke for her past, her struggles, her hope. It was as if she was talking to her mother again through sound. The music was her thank you, her apology, and her promise all at once. Edward watched silently. He didn't smile or nod. He simply listened. He could feel something stirring in him, something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just admiration. It was realization. For so long he had measured success by money, power, and control. But seeing Clara up there, humble yet confident, made him understand how empty those things could be without meaning behind them. When the last note faded, the room stayed silent for a long moment. Then, as if waking from a dream, the audience erupted in applause. Some stood, clapping until their hands hurt. Clara bowed slightly, her cheeks flushed, her heart full. This applause felt different from the one at the gala. That night they had clapped out of surprise. Tonight they clapped out of respect. After the concert ended, people gathered around her to congratulate and thank her. She was overwhelmed but grateful. Even Mr. Bennett, the foundation director, was beaming. "You have a rare gift," he told her warmly. "Your music reaches people." Clara smiled, still catching her breath. "Thank you for giving me the chance." Edward waited until the crowd thinned before approaching. When Clara saw him, she hesitated, unsure of what he might say. But his expression was gentle, not proud or distant as before. "You were amazing," he said quietly. "That was one of the most moving performances I've ever seen." She smiled softly. "I'm glad you came." "I wouldn't have missed it," he said, glancing at the piano. "I wanted to see where your music would take you." "It's taking me somewhere I didn't expect," she admitted. "I used to think my dreams were over. But now, I don't know. Maybe it's never too late." Edward nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. It's never too late." He paused, then added, "If you ever want help, financially or otherwise, I'd be happy to support you." Clara shook her head gently. "I appreciate it, but I think I need to do this on my own. For the first time in my life, I want to see where I can go without anyone pulling the strings." Her words surprised him, but he respected them. "Then I'll just be cheering from the audience," he said with a small smile. She laughed softly. "That's enough." In the following weeks, Clara's performance began to gain attention. Someone had recorded her playing at the concert, and the video started spreading online. People were moved by her story, the cleaning worker who stunned a room full of wealthy guests with her talent. She received messages from strangers all over, praising her and encouraging her to keep playing. For the first time, she felt seen not for what she did to survive, but for who she truly was. The company where she worked also changed. Her co-workers treated her differently now. Not out of pity, but respect. Some even asked if she would teach them a few notes during breaks. Clara laughed every time, saying she wasn't a real teacher, but she didn't mind showing them the basics. Music brought everyone a little closer together. Edward, meanwhile, had begun to change in his own way. The more he thought about Clara's story, the more he reflected on his life. He started treating his employees with more kindness and patience. He even introduced a scholarship program through his company for workers who wanted to study arts or pursue personal goals. It was his way of giving back, though he never admitted how much of it was inspired by her. One afternoon, he invited Clara to meet him at a small cafe near the office. She agreed, curious about what he wanted to discuss. "I wanted to tell you something," Edward began once they sat down. "Your story made me realize something important. For years, I thought success was about being on top, about never showing weakness. But last night, when I saw you on that stage, I saw what real strength looks like." Clara looked surprised. "I'm not sure I'm strong," she said quietly. "You are," he said. "You faced humiliation and turned it into something beautiful. You reminded me that there's power in humility, and maybe I needed to see that." His honesty touched her. "Sometimes we all forget what matters," she said. "But life has a way of reminding us." They talked for a while, not as boss and worker, but as two people who had both been changed by a single moment of truth. When they parted, Edward promised to attend her next performance, and this time he meant it as a friend. Months passed, and Clara continued to play at local events or even began teaching small music classes for children who couldn't afford lessons. Watching their eyes light up when they learned to play their first song filled her with joy. In helping them, she found something deeper than applause, purpose. Edward attended one of her classes one day. He stood quietly at the back, watching the children laugh and play simple melodies. When their lesson ended, he approached her. "You look happier than I've ever seen you," he said. "I am," she replied with a smile. "Music gave me back my life, and now I get to share it," he nodded. "You've done more good here than you probably realize." She looked around at the children packing up their instruments. "They remind me of me," she said softly. "All they need is a chance," Edward smiled. "You gave them that chance." As the day ended, they stood near the doorway watching the sunset through the classroom window. It painted the room in soft golden light. For both of them, life had shifted in ways they never expected. She had found her place again, and he had found a piece of his humanity. Neither of them knew what the future would bring, but one thing was certain. The night that began with humiliation had turned into a story of redemption, kindness, and second chances, and that perhaps was the most beautiful melody of all. Weeks turned into months, and Clara's life continued to change in quiet but powerful ways. Her music lessons for children became a small but joyful part of the community. Parents often stopped by just to listen through the door while their kids played clumsy but heartfelt tunes. The little classroom, once empty and dusty, was now filled with laughter, piano notes, and dreams being born. Clara felt fulfilled in a way she hadn't thought possible. But even as she built this new chapter of her life, she sometimes found herself thinking back to that night at the gala, the night that had changed everything. Not with bitterness anymore, but with gratitude. It had been the beginning of something she didn't know she needed. One afternoon, as she finished a lesson, a man approached her with a warm smile. It was Mr. Bennett, the director of the Music Foundation who had given her that first concert opportunity. "Clara," he said cheerfully, "you've done so much good here. The foundation has noticed how much your work is inspiring people." She looked a little surprised. "I'm just teaching children, Mr. Bennett," he laughed. "You're doing much more than that. You're bringing hope. We're planning a larger charity concert next month, a citywide event, and we'd like you to be one of the main performers." Clara's breath caught. "Me?" "Yes, you," he said firmly. "And this time it'll be televised. People need to see what true passion looks like." For a moment she didn't know what to say. It felt unreal, her journey from cleaning halls to standing on a real stage. But she saw the sincerity in Mr. Bennett's eyes and nodded slowly. "I'd be honored." As the weeks passed, she practiced every evening. Her students encouraged her, some even making little signs that said, "Go, Miss Clara." The community that once barely knew her now supported her wholeheartedly. Even Edward offered help. arranging for a piano tuner and sending flowers to the classroom before her big performance. He didn't attach a note, but she knew they were from him. The night of the concert arrived. The Grand Theater was filled with people, families, reporters, music lovers, and supporters of the foundation. Bright lights, banners, and cameras surrounded the stage. It was overwhelming, but Clara stayed calm. This time she wasn't playing to prove anything. She was playing to share something beautiful. When she stepped onto the stage, the audience erupted into applause. She smiled softly, her heart steady. She sat at the piano, closed her eyes for a brief moment, and began to play. The music started softly, a tender melody that grew deeper with every note. It told her story without a single word. The hardship, the quiet strength, the rediscovered joy. People listened in silence, drawn into her world. Even the camera seemed to fade away. All that existed in that moment was her and the piano. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. Some in the audience stood, wiping away tears. Clara looked around, overwhelmed. She bowed her head humbly, thanking them with a smile. For a long time, she stood there, soaking in the moment, not as someone who had been humiliated, but as someone who had risen above it all. Backstage, reporters waited to speak with her. "Clara, how does it feel to have come this far?" one asked. She thought for a second before answering softly, "It feels like finding home again." Another asked, "What message would you give to people who feel like their dreams are over?" She smiled. "Dreams don't die," she said. "They just wait for us to find them again." The next morning, her performance became a sensation online. Clips of her playing spread across social media, and people shared her story. The humble worker who silenced a millionaire with her talent. But for Clara, the real joy came from seeing the faces of her students the next day. They ran to her, hugging her tightly, proud and excited. "You were amazing, Miss Clara," they shouted. She laughed, holding them close. "Thank you, my stars," she said warmly. "Now it's your turn to shine." Meanwhile, Edward watched the broadcast from his home. He sat quietly, a faint smile on his face. Seeing Clara on that stage made him reflect even more deeply on his own life. He had everything: wealth, property, respect. But for the first time, he realized he wanted something money couldn't buy: meaning. Watching her, he saw what real success looked like, not in numbers or power, but in purpose and love for what one does. A few days later, Edward visited Clara's classroom. The children were finishing a lesson when he arrived, and their laughter filled the air. When they saw him, they grew curious. "Is that your boss?" one whispered loudly, making Clara chuckle. After class, he handed her a small folder. "I've been thinking," he said. "You've built something incredible here. But I want to help it grow." She looked at him, puzzled. "What do you mean?" He opened the folder. Inside was a proposal: funding to expand her little classroom into a full community music center. There would be instruments, scholarships for children, and space for performances. "This isn't charity," Edward said quickly. "It's an investment in people who deserve opportunities, in people like you." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Edward, this is too much," he shook his head. "No, it's not enough. You showed me that wealth means nothing unless it helps someone else. Let me do this. Let's make this happen together." She hesitated, but finally smiled. "All right," she said softly. "But only if it's truly for the children." "It is," he promised. Months later, the new music center opened its doors. The grand opening was filled with excitement. The walls were painted in bright colors. The rooms echoed with laughter and music. And on the entrance wall hung a small plaque that read, "Where music gives second chances." Clara stood at the doorway, welcoming students and parents, her heart full. Edward stood beside her, proud but humble. During the ceremony, Mr. Bennett gave a short speech. "This center is more than just a place for music," he said. "It's proof that one act of kindness, or even one mistake, can start something beautiful." Clara's story reminds us that talent can be found anywhere, and that respect can change lives. The audience clapped warmly. Clara felt her eyes water but didn't hide it. She wasn't ashamed of her emotions anymore. As the evening went on, Edward found himself standing near the piano, the same type that once stood in his ballroom. He remembered the night he forced her to play, and how that simple act had changed both of their lives forever. Clara approached him quietly and said, "Funny, isn't it? How one moment can change everything." He nodded. "It changed me more than you know," he admitted. "You taught me more in one song than all my years in business ever did." She smiled. Maybe we both needed that night for different reasons. Edward laughed softly. Maybe so. As the sun began to set outside, the children gathered around the piano, asking Clara to play something. She sat down, motioning for them to join her. Soon a few tiny hands pressed keys beside hers, creating a playful mix of notes that made everyone laugh. Edward stood back watching the scene with a quiet sense of peace. It struck him how simple happiness could be. A melody, laughter, connection. Things he had spent years overlooking. For the first time, he felt truly grateful, not for what he owned, but for what he had learned. When the night ended, Clara walked outside and looked up at the stars. The world felt big again, full of possibility. The woman who once cleaned floors now helped children build dreams. The man who once humiliated her had become her friend and supporter. Life had come full circle, and in the most unexpected way, everything made sense. Clara closed her eyes, feeling the cool breeze against her face. Somewhere deep inside, she could almost hear her mother's voice again, soft and proud. You did it, Clara. You found your way back. She smiled through the tears that followed. Yes, she whispered to herself. I did. The lights from the music center glowed behind her, and the laughter of children spilled out into the night. For Clara, it was more than success, and it was peace. And for Edward, who watched from the doorway, it was redemption. Two lives, once divided by pride and circumstance, now connected by something pure and timeless, music. Time passed quietly after the music center opened. The place became a second home, not just for Clara and the children, but for the entire community. The sounds of pianos, violins, and laughter filled the building from morning until evening. People came from nearby towns just to see what everyone was talking about, the small center that grew from one woman's courage to keep believing in her gift. Clara had found peace in teaching. Each child reminded her that every dream starts small. Some days were noisy and chaotic, with little fingers pressing the wrong keys or forgetting the rhythm. But she never lost patience. She would laugh, guide their hands gently, and remind them, music isn't about being perfect, it's about feeling it. One rainy afternoon, as she was tidying up after class, she found an old piece of paper tucked between the pages of one of the songbooks. It was the original letter she had written years ago when she had applied for a music scholarship. The one that had never reached its destination, because life had taken her in a different direction. Seeing her younger handwriting brought tears to her eyes. The dreams she'd once written about, performing, teaching, helping others through music. They had all somehow come true, though in a way she could have never imagined. Later that week, Edward visited the center again. His visits had become less formal and more friendly over time. He no longer arrived in expensive suits or with assistants. Instead, he often came dressed simply, bringing snacks for the kids or new sheet music he thought they might enjoy. When he entered that day, he noticed Clara sitting at the piano, lost in thought. Old memories? He asked gently. She looked up, smiling faintly. You could say that. I found something I wrote a long time ago, back when I still believed I could make a living out of music. Edward walked closer. And now? She looked around the lively classroom and then back at him. Now I think I was always meant to, just not in the way I expected. He nodded slowly. Life has a strange way of bringing us back to where we belong. For a moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the soft sound of rain against the windows. Edward sat down beside her, his expression thoughtful. You know, he said after a pause, I've been planning something. The company wants to host another gala, but this time it won't be about showing off. I want it to support the arts. I was hoping you would play again. Clara blinked in surprise. Another gala? He smiled gently. Yes, but this one will be different. The focus will be on talent, not wealth. The theme is music for all. I want to raise funds for centers like this one. You've shown me how powerful it can be. For a long moment, she said nothing. The thought of returning to a gala, to that kind of audience, brought back memories of her humiliation years ago. But this time things were different. She was different. All right, she said finally, smiling. I'll do it. The weeks leading up to the gala were filled with excitement. Edward worked tirelessly to plan the event. This time he wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wanted to make a difference. Invitations went out not just to business elites, but to local artists, students, and music lovers. The media picked up on the story. the wealthy businessman and the once humiliated worker joining forces to support the arts. On the night of the gala, the ballroom was filled again, but the air felt completely different. Gone was the arrogance and coldness of before. People greeted each other warmly, and instead of silent judgment, there was genuine anticipation. The decorations were elegant but simple, and at the front of the room stood a banner that read, "Where music connects us all." Clara stood backstage, her hands calm this time. She wore a light blue dress, nothing extravagant, but it suited her perfectly. When she peeked through the curtain, she saw Edward talking with guests, smiling in a way that looked natural, even joyful. It made her heart swell a little. They had both come so far. When it was her turn to perform, Edward introduced her himself. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice steady but emotional, "tonight's performer is someone who changed not just the way I see music, but the way I see life. Her story reminds us that talent and dignity have nothing to do with status or money. Please welcome Clara." The audience erupted into applause. Clara stepped onto the stage, the soft light surrounding her like a gentle embrace. She sat at the piano, took a deep breath, and began to play. Her song that night was unlike any other she had played before. It started quietly, a slow melody that carried a sense of reflection, a remembrance of her journey from pain to peace. Then gradually it grew into something powerful and full of light. Each note told a story, of loss, of courage, of kindness that had blossomed in unexpected places. The audience listened in complete silence, some with eyes closed, others with tears on their faces. When she reached the final note, the sound lingered in the air like a whisper that refused to fade. And then the room erupted into applause. People stood clapping and cheering, not out of surprise this time, but pure admiration. Clara rose, her heart beating fast, overwhelmed by the love in the room. Edward was the first to stand. His eyes glistened as he clapped, a proud smile spreading across his face. When she bowed, their eyes met, and in that look, everything that needed to be said passed between them: apology, gratitude, and peace. After the performance, Edward approached her backstage. "You did it again," he said softly. "You moved everyone," she laughed lightly. "I didn't do it alone," she said. "You helped make tonight possible." He shook his head. "You gave it meaning." They both smiled, and for a while neither spoke. Then Edward reached into his coat pocket and handed her a small envelope. "What's this?" she asked. "Just something small," he said. "Open it later." When she finally did, after returning home, she found a simple handwritten note inside. It said, "For believing when I didn't. Thank you for showing me the right kind of success." Below the note was a small donation receipt. Edward had given a large part of his company's profits to fund music programs for underprivileged children across the country. Clara felt her eyes fill with tears again, but this time they were tears of gratitude. The man who once humiliated her had now become a true ally to those like her. Life had written the most unexpected ending, or perhaps a new beginning. Months passed and the music center flourished. More children joined, more teachers volunteered, and Clara became something of a quiet local hero. Journalists sometimes came to interview her, but she always downplayed her fame. "It's not about me," she would say. "It's about what music can do for people." Edward continued to visit often, though their relationship had evolved into something deeper than friendship, a mutual respect and quiet care that didn't need words. Together they organized concerts, raised funds, and created programs for young musicians. One evening, after a long day of teaching, Clara sat alone at the piano. The classroom was empty, but the soft glow of the sunset poured through the windows. She began to play a gentle tune, one she had been composing for months. It was her way of saying goodbye to the past, a final chapter for the girl who once dreamed in secret. She didn't hear Edward come in until he was standing by the door listening. When she finished, he said softly, "That was beautiful. What do you call it?" She looked up with a small smile. "The gift," he nodded. "That's exactly what it is." As the evening light faded, they stood there in quiet understanding. The past had taught them both lessons they would never forget. For Clara, it was the courage to keep dreaming, even when life tried to silence her. For Edward, it was learning that true greatness comes not from power, but from humility and kindness. Outside, the streetlights began to flicker on, and the distant laughter of children echoed through the night. Clara pressed one final key, letting the note linger, soft, hopeful, endless. Her story had come full circle, from humiliation to triumph, from pain to peace, from silence to music. And in that melody, the world could hear not just her story, but the truth that everyone carries, that dignity and beauty can rise from the unlikeliest places, and that even in a world of wealth and pride, the simplest song can still touch the deepest heart.